In 1921, one of America's most prosperous black communities was destroyed in less than 2 days. Homes were burned, businesses were looted, thousands of people were forced from their homes. This was Greenwood, Tulsa's Black Wall Street, a thriving community built by Black Americans. But within hours, that prosperity was transformed into fire, smoke, and ruins. And when the smoke cleared, the full story was barely preserved in the official record. So what really happened in Tulsa? And why did America spend decades trying to forget it? The morning of June 1st, 1921, began with the sound of airplanes. Civilian aircraft circled low over Tulsa's Greenwood district as fires spread across the neighborhood. For survivors below, the aircraft became a part of a terrifying assault that would leave much of Greenwood in ruins. Survivors later described aircraft flying low over Greenwood, and some accounts reported gunfire and incendiary devices coming from the air. The use of aircraft for surveillance is documented. The more specific claims of aerial bombing remain a matter of historical debate. What is certain is that people on the ground experienced the aircraft as another source of terror. An estimated 100 to 300 people were dead, and a district known across the country as Black Wall Street had been erased from the map. This was Greenwood, a 1,400-acre neighborhood that had become, by the spring of 1921, the wealthiest concentration of Black-owned businesses, banks, hotels, theaters, and professional offices anywhere in the United States. Greenwood's success was not incidental. It was, in part, a direct consequence of segregation because Black Tulsans, barred by law and custom from spending their money in white-owned establishments downtown, built their own economy instead. One that by 1921 included the Stratford Hotel, a 54-room luxury establishment owned by J.B. Stratford. That spark arrived on May 30th, 1921, Memorial Day, inside the Drexel Building at 319 South Main Street, in an elevator operated by a 17-year-old white girl named Sarah Page. A 19-year-old black shoe shiner named Dick Rowland entered that elevator, and something happened between them that no surviving contemporary account describes with certainty or consistency. The most common explanation, offered by later investigators piecing together fragmentary testimony, holds that Rowland either tripped or stumbled while entering the elevator, and in catching himself, grabbed Page's arm or hand, causing her to scream. By the following morning, the Tulsa Tribune, an afternoon newspaper with a documented history of sensationalist and racially inflammatory reporting, had published a front-page story with the headline, "Nab Negro for Attacking Girl in Elevator," an account that the physical and circumstantial evidence simply does not support. Rowland was arrested that morning and taken to the Tulsa County Courthouse, and by evening, a crowd of armed white Tulsans, estimated by various accounts to have grown into the hundreds and eventually over 1,000, had gathered outside demanding that Sheriff Willard McCullough hand the prisoner over. McCullough, to his credit, refused, moving Rowland to the top floor of the courthouse, positioning armed deputies on the roof, and disabling the building's elevator to slow any attempt to storm the upper floors. It was into this volatile standoff that a group of approximately 25 armed black men, many of them World War I veterans who had served in France and returned home determined not to watch another lynching happen without resistance, arrived at the courthouse around 9:30 that evening. They offered their assistance to the sheriff, were turned away, and left, but returned a second time roughly 2 hours later after further rumors circulated that the white mob was preparing to force its way inside. It was in the chaos of this second confrontation, as the small group of black veterans faced a much larger white crowd outside the courthouse, that gunfire suddenly erupted. Within moments, the confrontation had become a wider battle. The outnumbered group of armed black men, having come to prevent a lynching, now found themselves the target of a mob whose numbers were swelling by the minute as word spread through downtown Tulsa's saloons, pool halls, and street corners. Reports reaching the courthouse and the police station described white residents breaking into hardware stores and pawn shops throughout downtown Tulsa, looting rifles, shotguns, and ammunition, sometimes with the tacit permission or even active assistance of store owners, and according to multiple later accounts, in the presence of police who did nothing to stop it. This detail matters enormously to understanding what separates the Tulsa Massacre from a spontaneous riot in the conventional sense. The weapons that would be used to burn Greenwood to the ground were not brought by an organized militia from outside the city. They were provided, in significant part, by Tulsa's own commercial infrastructure. By the early hours of June 1st, the character of the violence had shifted decisively. What had been a confrontation centered on the courthouse became a coordinated advance into Greenwood itself. The Oklahoma National Guard was also mobilized during the night, and other testimony describes Guard members participating in the mass detention of black Tulsans, herding thousands of men, women, and children at gunpoint to makeshift internment sites at the Convention Hall, the Fairgrounds, and McNulty Park, where they would be held, in some cases for days, under armed guard while their homes and businesses burned less than a mile away. This detail, the mass internment of an entire community's population under military and quasi-military guard, is one of the most overlooked aspects of the massacre. The physical destruction of Greenwood began in earnest as dawn broke on June 1st. Multiple eyewitness accounts describe armed groups moving through the district, entering homes and businesses, taking property, and setting buildings on fire. Aircraft did fly low over Greenwood during the attack. Survivor accounts describe them being used not only for observation, but also alleged gunfire and incendiary devices from the air. Because the physical evidence for those specific claims remains limited, historians continued to debate the exact role the aircraft played. Dr. A.C. Jackson, a black surgeon whom the Mayo brothers were said to have once called the most able Negro surgeon in America, was reportedly shot and killed after surrendering to a group of white men outside his home, his hands raised, according to witness accounts collected years later. J.B. Stratford, the hotel owner, whose 54-room establishment represented one of the single largest black-owned investments in the country, escaped Tulsa that night, fled the state, and was, in a bitter historical irony, indicted by the Tulsa County Grand Jury not as a victim of arson and looting, but one of the instigators of the violence. Dick Rowland, the 19-year-old whose alleged encounter with Sarah Page had set the entire catastrophe in motion, had all charges against him dropped by the county attorney within weeks, and Rowland himself left Tulsa and, according to most accounts, was never publicly heard from again in any documented capacity. By the morning of June 1st, National Guard troops had been deployed to Tulsa and helped restore order, but Greenwood had already suffered catastrophic destruction. Much of the district that had existed the day before was now reduced to ruins. The physical toll, using the most conservative contemporary estimates, was staggering. Over 1,000 homes destroyed, dozens of businesses reduced to rubble and ash. The Mount Zion Baptist Church, whose construction had been completed weeks earlier, burned to its foundation. The human toll remains, even a century later, a subject of active historical investigation rather than settled fact. Official death tolls recorded at the time listed as few as 36 dead, a figure historians now regard as a dramatic undercount. Modern estimates, including those developed by the 2001 Oklahoma Commission, place the likely death toll between 100 and 300 people. Questions about where some of the dead were buried would remain unresolved for decades. Nearly a century later, researchers and city officials began investigating reports of possible mass burial sites in and around Tulsa. As Greenwood's residents began trying to rebuild, new fire code requirements created another obstacle. The proposed rules favored more expensive fire-resistant construction, raising fears that rebuilding would become financially impossible for many survivors. Greenwood's residents, led by attorneys including the Black lawyer B.C. Franklin, whose son John Hope Franklin would go on to become one of the most eminent American historians of the 20th century, fought this ordinance in court and ultimately won, with the Oklahoma Supreme Court striking down the fire code as an unconstitutional taking. A legal victory that allowed reconstruction to proceed. But even this victory came at a cost, because the litigation delayed reconstruction for months, during which many displaced families, still living in tents provided by the American Red Cross through the brutal winter of 1921 into 1922, had no choice but to relocate elsewhere permanently. Insurance proved to be another dead end for Greenwood's victims, and the reason why reveals another layer of how the massacre's aftermath compounded its initial injustice. Nearly all of the insurance claims filed by Black property owners for fire and property damage were denied, with insurers placing the destruction under standard policy exclusions for damage caused by riot or civil commotion. That grand jury, convened within days of the massacre, produced a report that concluded that the riot had been caused by Black Tulsans, specifically by the armed group that had gone to the courthouse to prevent Rowland's lynching, and by what the report characterized as an atmosphere of overconfidence and social agitation among Tulsa's Black population. No white Tulsan was indicted for murder, arson, burglary, or any other crime connected to the destruction of Greenwood, despite the fact that thousands of white residents had participated, some even photographed by opportunistic photographers who sold postcards of the destruction, complete with images of dead Black bodies as souvenirs. The financial losses were enormous. The Oklahoma Commission's 2001 report estimated property damage at approximately $1.5 to $1.8 million in 1921 values, a staggering loss of homes, businesses, and accumulated wealth. The destruction of a self-sustaining economic ecosystem that had taken over a decade to build. The community did, against extraordinary odds, rebuild much of the district by the mid-1920s, only to see it decline again in subsequent decades due to discriminatory lending practices, and later, in a bitter historical echo, the construction of Interstate 244 directly through the heart of what remained of the district in the 1960s and 1970s. For decades, the Tulsa Race Massacre received little attention in mainstream American historical education. In Oklahoma and beyond, the event was often omitted, minimized, or remembered only briefly, helping create a silence that lasted for generations. As the decades passed, references to the event became increasingly limited in many Oklahoma public narratives. When it was mentioned, it was often described using the older term Tulsa Race Riot, language that could obscure the scale and asymmetry of the violence. The terminology was not incidental. It was the term used by the original 1921 grand jury, and its persistence in official usage for the following 80 decades reflects the degree to which the original self-exculpatory framing of white Tulsa's civic and legal establishment succeeded in shaping how the event would be remembered. Oklahoma school children, including those growing up in Tulsa itself, only a few miles from Greenwood, routinely reported well into the late 19th century having never been taught about the massacre in any classroom setting, a silence so complete that many white Tulsans genuinely had no knowledge that it had occurred, while black Tulsans, particularly survivors and their immediate descendants, largely maintained their own silence as well. Trauma, fear of retaliation, and in some cases a grim, pragmatic understanding that speaking openly about what had happened carried real risk in a city and state where the perpetrators or their direct descendants continued to hold positions of economic and political power. It would take the convergence of several forces, beginning in the late 1990s, to finally break this near-total silence and force Oklahoma to confront, publicly and officially, what had happened in the early morning hours of June 1st, 1921. A reckoning that would ultimately lead investigators back to the same question that had haunted survivors and their descendants for generations. Where, precisely, were the dead actually buried, and how many of them were there? The search for those graves, when it finally began in earnest in 2018 under Tulsa Mayor G.T. Bynum, would itself become one of the most significant chapters in the long, difficult process of reckoning with what had happened in 1921. The excavation efforts have been informed by research into historical records, survivor testimonies, newspaper archives, and photographic evidence from 1921. But the fragmentary nature of these sources means that much uncertainty remains about the exact locations and numbers of burial sites. At Oak Lawn Cemetery, researchers have focused on specific areas believed, based on survivor testimony and historical photographs, to contain mass burials from June 1921, burials made in haste and without individual identification, making the remains difficult to locate and distinguish, even with modern forensic archaeology techniques. The excavation efforts have been accompanied by intensive historical research into the identities of the deceased, efforts undertaken by genealogists, historians, and descendants of survivors, working to recover the individual names and stories of those whose deaths were officially forgotten or deliberately erased from the record. The physical evidence of mass burial, when uncovered, tells a story that the official records tried to bury. Evidence of multiple bodies interred together in unmarked graves. Evidence of haste and lack of ceremony. Evidence that the Tulsa authorities, in the immediate aftermath of the massacre, prioritized concealing the death toll over preserving the dignity of the deceased or honoring the grief of survivors. The effort to identify individual victims has been painstaking work involving DNA analysis, genealogical research, historical documentation, and the testimony of descendants who have carried the oral history of their lost relatives across generations, even in the context of official silence. Survivors and descendants of victims have been essential to the process of recovering historical truth, many of them coming forward decades after the massacre, in some cases near the end of their lives, to ensure that the stories of their lost loved ones were not permanently erased from history. The 2001 Oklahoma Commission to Study the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921, established through legislative action and funded by the state, conducted a comprehensive investigation that lasted several years and produced a final report that, for the first time, officially acknowledged the massacre as a historical fact and provided a detailed reconstruction of events based on evidence, survivor testimony, and historical research. The Commission's findings, documented in detail in a final report made public in 2001, established definitively that the destruction of Greenwood was not a spontaneous riot, but a coordinated assault, that it involved systematic looting and arson, that it included the participation of law enforcement and National Guard units, and that it was followed by systematic efforts to erase the historical record. The Commission's report and subsequent community-led efforts have called for reparations to survivors and descendants, the establishment of educational memorials and museums, the inclusion of the massacre in school curricula, and formal state and local government apologies, recommendations that have only been partially and incompletely implemented. The physical reclamation of Greenwood as a space of historical memory and education has been one avenue through which the community has worked to ensure that the massacre is no longer forgotten or erased. Historic structures have been preserved, new memorials have been erected, and the Greenwood district has been developed as a center for historical learning and community healing. The descendants of survivors remain in Tulsa and beyond, carrying forward the history and memory of what their ancestors endured, and serving as living evidence that the massacre's consequences have not ended, but continue to shape family histories, community identity, and ongoing struggles for justice and recognition. The economic consequences extended far beyond the buildings that burned. Greenwood lost homes, businesses, property, and years of accumulated economic opportunity. The destruction, combined with insurance disputes and later discriminatory policies, contributed to long-term economic consequences for the community.
The process of reckoning with the Tulsa Massacre remains ongoing. Important progress has been made in documenting the history and acknowledging what occurred, but questions surrounding justice, remembrance, and the long-term consequences remain unresolved. The Tulsa Massacre exists within a broader historical context of racial violence and institutional racism in the United States. Understanding what happened in Greenwood in 1921 requires understanding not just the specific events of those 16 hours, but the systems of racial oppression, economic inequality, and historical suppression that made the massacre possible and allowed it to be buried for so long. Modern scholarship continues to develop our understanding of the massacre, with historians, archivists, genealogists, archaeologists, and community leaders working collectively to answer remaining questions about what exactly happened, who was responsible, how many died, and what justice and healing might look like. The victims of the Tulsa Massacre remain central to understanding what occurred. Though we will never know all their names or the exact count of the dead, we must work to remember them as individuals, as people with families, aspirations, skills, and lives that were cut short by racial violence and then erased from official history. Tulsa, Oklahoma, remains a city where the geography of racial history is still visible in the physical landscape, in the location of memorials and museums, in the Greenwood District's particular character, in the marks of past violence and ongoing recovery. To visit Tulsa in the 21st century is to confront directly the reality that historical injustice does not remain safely in the past, but continues to shape present-day communities, families, and questions of justice.
The story of the Tulsa Massacre is not complete simply because it has been told. Descendants continue to preserve family memories, researchers continue to examine the evidence, and the community continues to confront what the massacre meant and what remembering it requires today. For nearly a century, the truth of what happened in Greenwood lay buried, quite literally in some cases, beneath the surface of Tulsa's official history. The work of excavating that truth, of bringing it into light, of honoring the dead and demanding justice, continues to be the work of survivors' descendants, historians, archaeologists, educators, and all those who refuse to let the Tulsa Massacre be forgotten again. The Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 was a tragedy of prosperity, racial violence, destruction, and decades of silence. But the story did not disappear. Today, descendants, historians, archaeologists, educators, and communities continue the work of remembering Greenwood and recovering the truth.